Paul, and I would like to invite Paul Thornton, who is, Paul was here with us for many years and decided to move to Texas, and he has created now the second largest hyperinsulinism program in the United States in Fort Worth, Texas. So he's going to talk to us about the guidelines for diagnosis and treating hypoglycemia in infants. Oh, you don't have to? No. We'll leave it here.
All right, thank you, Diva. It's a pleasure always coming back to Philadelphia, but it's a greater pleasure to meet all the families. As time goes on and my time from Philadelphia has been longer, I find I know less and less of the families who come here. But sometimes we get together in the south and then we know a few more. I'd like to follow up a little bit more about some of the things that Dr. Stanley talked about. So he spoke about how Macquarie in the early 1950s, felt it was so imperative to talk to everyone at the AAP meeting about hypoglycemia, and how he realized that there was such a dearth of information and that we really need to do a better job of early identification and better treatment of the patients. And since that time in the endocrine community, we've had huge progress in identifying different clinical forms of hyperinsulinism, in identifying the genes, and new ways of treating in terms of diagnosing with scans. And as an endocrine community, we've also done a tremendously good job of educating other endocrinologists who are willing to learn. But the one area where we haven't made a lot of progress in the past has been the issue of educating the neonatologists. And so several years ago, a guideline came out by neonatologists on how to manage babies in the first 24 hours of life. And everyone was very excited because we thought this was going to change the world and that neonatologists were going to pick up all our babies real quickly, diagnose them and send them off to see us where we could start implementing good therapies and care. But that didn't happen, and it didn't happen because the major problem with those guidelines was that they really wanted to focus on how to identify normal babies who drop their blood sugar in the first 2 hours of life, which happens to 50% of normal babies, and then get them out of the hospital fast. And that seemed to be the primary goal, and the goal didn't seem to be how do we identify those babies who are not normal, who have a problem, and what do we do and how do we refer them out. So about 5 years ago, a group of endocrinologists got together. You know most of us, Dr. Stanley, Dr. De Leon, Dr. Hussein, some of the endocrinologists from all over the world. We involved neonatologists, and we sat down and decided to develop a consensus statement on recommendations for the management of hypoglycemia in the newborn period. We also did it for older infants and children, because not only are newborn babies missed with hypoglycemia, but a lot of times children will come into the emergency room and they'll have low blood sugars and maybe they'd been vomiting for a little while. So the doctors automatically assumed that the problem was that the patient was just vomiting and hadn't eaten in a long time, and they'd get their blood sugar up and send them home, not knowing that 10% of those kids who come in to the emergency room have a serious problem. So there were a lot of reasons why we needed to do these guidelines. So we set out, we reviewed all the literature, we worked really hard for 3 years, we came up with a first draft. We actually sent it out to the committee of neonatologists who'd written their paper. We sent it to Chi, who had some reviewers review it and gave us feedback. And we got feedback from people from all over the world. And then we made a lot of changes. And finally, in I think it was June or July of last year, the paper was published. And as Dr. Stanley says, it's free on the internet. So just go ahead in and type in our names and you'll find it and you can download it. It's on the website, the front page of the Chi website. And you might think, has that made any differences? Well, at the end of the year, we got a little letter from the journal to say that our paper was in one of the top 5 papers downloaded in 2015. So what did the guidelines do? Well, basically, we gave advice on what babies to screen. Now, some of you are probably going to say, well, that's a no-brainer, just screen everyone. Well, that would create a tremendous burden, and you have to remember that although 1 in 50,000 babies have hyperinsulinism, 1 in 49,999 don't, and you don't have to screen everyone to pick up the babies with hyperinsulinism. You just have to respond appropriately to the babies who have a low blood sugar that you find and make the right decisions. So what we basically did was we added some people into the guidelines who should be screened. For example, in the older guidelines, they never said, that you need to screen children who have perinatal stress, and we know that perinatal stress can cause low blood sugars. But we made a really big point of saying to people that you have to screen people who have genetic forms of hypoglycemia, and you have to screen babies who have physical signs that might suggest that they have a disease. For example, if they look like they might have Beckwith-Wiedemann syndrome, or if they had a cleft lip or palate that could indicate another form of hypoglycemia, you should screen. We also taught them when you should screen. So you should screen the blood sugars early, and you should follow them, and then you should, if a baby continues to have a low blood sugar, you have to decide, when am I going to investigate the child? And Dr. Stanley wrote another beautiful paper where he described the normal pattern of changes of glucose in newborn babies. And what we've learned from that paper, sorry, I've just got my timer going here. What we learned from that paper was that there's no point in doing a diagnostic workup in a baby at 2 hours of age, because the blood test will look like the baby has hyperinsulinism, because a normal baby secretes a lot more insulin in utero, and when the baby comes out and goes from continuous food from the mom through the placenta to intermittent food, the body has to learn to secrete insulin a little differently. And so what we recommended is that if your baby is having low blood sugars that are going past 2 days of life, or if your baby needed to have glucose to treat a low blood sugar, then you need to do a special workup and find out why that baby is having a problem. So we then went on and gave them guidelines about how to treat those babies, what level of blood sugar to shoot for, encouraging them to always oral feed, but to keep the blood sugar above 50 for the first 2 days of life, and then above 60. And we taught them the difference between when you know your baby has a blood sugar problem, such as hyperinsulinism, that now you should treat the babies up to 70, whereas when it's a healthy newborn baby who just has a little low blood sugar, you feed them and make sure it stays above 50. And then we gave advice on how to diagnose the specific forms of hyperinsulinism. So the result of the guidelines has been, number one, that it's been extremely well received. We've had a lot of positive feedback. Most of us who wrote the guidelines have been invited to go give speeches, to go talk to neonatal groups. We've already participated in changing policies in multiple neonatal units. I often get asked to review a neonatal unit's glucose policy, have a look at it and see, do we think that they're doing the right things? And we hope that in the future we'll see that all babies with hyperinsulinism who can be diagnosed in the newborn period will be diagnosed, and that early treatment will be implemented, that their blood sugars will be kept up over 70, and they'll get to centers of excellence where they can do PET scans like here in Philadelphia, and with surgeons like Dr. Adzik, who can do incredible work and cure the focal patients and really get a program that works for the other patients. So overall, I do want to thank all my co-authors. It was a huge amount of work, and I'd be happy to take any questions from anyone if they had questions.
When Zoe was diagnosed, she had a GI illness going on, and we ended up coming here. She had a 15% pancreatectomy, and when she had another low blood sugar issue, she also had another GI illness, do you guys find any correlation with GI-specific disease, or not diseases, but viruses at the same time when you guys do diagnose this? Because originally they did not want to do any testing the first time, but the second time we did do testing to see exactly what's going on.
Yeah, so that's a really good question. So there is absolutely no doubt that when you get a gastrointestinal illness and you're unable to eat or drink and you're vomiting and you don't want to eat and drink, it stresses the body out and causes the body to have to break down protein and make it into sugar, and to break down fat stores and make it into ketones and use those ketones. So the association between GI illness and hypoglycemia is really one that it unmasks an underlying problem. So it's not causing it. You don't get hyperinsulinism because you had a GI illness. You don't eat because you have a GI illness. Your blood sugar falls. And a good doctor, when they see the low blood sugar, will do some additional tests and be able to determine that there's a problem underlying. And you can very easily tell the difference between someone who's got a low blood sugar because they haven't eaten and they've been vomiting for 24 hours, and someone who has a low blood sugar because their body makes too much insulin. And so I think you said that they didn't test you the first time. We would advocate that any child who comes to the emergency room, and this is in the guidelines, that has a low blood sugar, that the reason for the low blood sugar is determined before the child goes home from the emergency room.
Any other questions? Oh.
So our daughter was diagnosed at 5 months. Is it that just one of those things where there's no way they could have detected that earlier? I mean, I'm guessing that in the hospital when she was born, there were no reasons for them to check her, but there were no signs on our side.
Yeah, so that's a very good point. I actually did a study on this, and I looked at every single hyperinsulinism patient who came to see me in the last 5 years who was not diagnosed in the neonatal unit. So they got home from the neonatal unit, and then they came back and got diagnosed. And what we found was that 60% of them, when you took the story from the mom and the dad and asked them what happened in the neonatal unit, or when you went back and got those records and read for yourself, could have been diagnosed if they followed our guidelines. So those children either had low blood sugars for 7 or 8 days, and then they were said, well, finally your blood sugar is over 50, you can go home now before we have to measure it again. Or they needed IV dextrose for 1 to 2 days and they were able to come off. So all of those things, if that happens, our guidelines will state to the neonatologist that they have to make a diagnosis of what the cause of that was. But the corollary of that is true, that 30% of the kids, we could not find any indication that there was a hint of a problem. And we often see that, especially in some of the focal kids and the line kids that you've heard about. Oftentimes they'll present around 1 year of age, between 8 months and 15 months of age, a little bit later. So some children do present late, and there's just no hint whatsoever. Yes.
Like, hey, shouldn't we be checking his blood sugar, because I've had problems with low blood sugar my whole life and no one ever listened to me, even his pediatrician. And I mean, I was even during delivery, my blood sugar dropped. I kept telling them, hey, you might want to check my blood sugar. And by the 3rd day that I was still in labor, I finally was like, look, I had to get mad and tell them, please check my blood sugar. I'm going to pass out. And then it was like 40 something. They're like, oh my God, your blood sugar is low. But it's like, I keep telling people this. It's like a lot of people, and I live in Houston, Texas. It's just like a lot of people don't take it seriously. And it's like, how many more times do I have to mention it, And anyway, sorry. I'm like, what else could I do, to tell these people you need to be paying attention?
Yes, well, I mean, I think the first thing is that the guidelines clearly state that if you have a family history of someone who has a hypoglycemic disorder, so I'm assuming perhaps you had one of those autosomal dominant disorders, that the children have a 50% chance of being affected and should be tested. But what you can do is why we're all here today. We're here for CHI, a family support organization whose job is not just to talk to moms and dads who are worried and concerned about their baby and give them support. I mean, that's a really important job. But another really important job is to go out and advocate, to get the word out there, to spread the word, to fundraise and help develop research. So all of these things are very important things that you guys do really well. So what I would say is get involved in the organization. You can go back to those hospitals where you were and you can say, hey, I know at the time you didn't know there was a guideline, but we've got these new guidelines, and if we'd have done this at that time, we'd have, found the baby. So, we'd like to see you implementing. So there's a lot of things that you can do. You could even do that, yeah.
And on our homepage, not only do we have the guidelines, but we have a call to action. So there are a number of really good suggestions about what you can all do to make sure that everybody in the world knows about these guidelines.
Yes, hi. I just wanted to say that because of the work that you guys did or that you guys continue doing when my daughter was first admitted to Miami Children's, it was because of an ER doctor that actually was just a little bit suspicious of the blood sugar dropping, and because of her we were able to be treated and then sent here. So I think it's important that the emergency room nurses and doctors are really the front line of defense, or the people that observe it quickly and get it over to the endocrinologists in the hospitals. So if it wasn't for this lady, who knows what would have happened, because even the pediatrician didn't even came back and said, I never would have known. And it's just that it's so important for the ER nurses and doctors to be aware that low blood sugar could be HI.
Yes, and I think that's one of the things that we do when we go out. We give grand rounds. We talk not only to neonatologists but also the emergency room physicians, and it is important through the advocacy to get the word out.
Absolutely.